throughout this past year, following the death of George Floyd and the pandemic that has really gripped the country, uh, it's been on a lot of leaders to really take the charge and combat the social unrest. And for a medical student such as myself, it's one thing to hear it from the administration, but for students and student groups to lead this front and bridging the gap and helping people understand it really was meaningful. So, with this in mind, I was president of a group called the Student National Medical Association, SNMA. And this is the main Black student organization on campus at the UAB School of Medicine. So for Juneteenth 2020, I hosted a discussion as well as other members of the group, and it was pretty good. So this is a recording of it. So going through this, the overall executive board included myself, Vice President Allison Steffens, Aubrey Smith, Kayla Ozimba, Karis Mitchell, and Jared Watson, as well as Lola Olaye. And getting to the overall message of what is Juneteenth, with the historical significance really being surrounding the Emancipation Proclamation following the Civil War and slaves being freed, and the idea of freedom versus notification, where the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, but Juneteenth really is celebrating the last slaves, I believe, in Galveston, Texas, getting notification that they were free. And a lot of people don't learn about this in school. And it's something when you look at the overall message of this as it relates to the impact of groups. So with this in mind, actually our recording of it had cut off. So I got us up to speed, and I'm gonna connect us to the recording from 2020, Juneteenth. Thank you.
If you're somebody from Mexico, you have a certain heritage that dates back generations. But for a lot of people and a lot of slaves that don't know what country they're from, it's just that collective history of the Black American experience. And as a history and a culture that was forged through a lot of hardship and a lot of struggle.
Hey, Michael.
Hello. Hey, Jason.
Hey, this is Jason. One thing I was just thinking about was, I think for a lot of the people that I grew up with, they spent so much time and energy trying to make the Civil War not be about slavery and not be about, and try to somehow do mental gymnastics to get around that point, that it was almost impossible for them to even acknowledge the Emancipation Proclamation as if it. And so, it's sort of like there's this whole, at least the culture that I grew up in was that the Civil War was not about slavery. It was about, a bunch of other things, which no one could ever seem to say. But, we always were just told it wasn't really about slavery. It was about 5 or 6 other things, but nobody ever could tell you that. And so I think it's just sort of, for if you're trying to not touch on this issue, then you're not even going to bother to know about something like Juneteenth, because it's almost like you can't even acknowledge that in your mind and still sleep at night.
Right. And that's kind of and what Dr. Young was mentioning earlier was getting to our second point of freedom does not equal notification when it comes to Juneteenth. And the Emancipation Proclamation being 2 years earlier before Juneteenth came, and that notification that slaves were free. And I want to bring up Lola to talk about this final point.
Okay, so with this final point, I wanted to highlight the power of apathy and its impact on disenfranchised groups. One thing that we noted was that, like Michael said, that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued January 1st, 1863, but the news didn't reach Texas until 2.5 years later. And one thing that a lot of Southern whites took advantage of was moving their slaves to Texas, knowing that this was something that happened just so that they could continue with the abuse of slavery and just enjoying their privileges. And I wanted us to maybe have a little bit of dialogue about that and how it can be a similar impact that we see today, and how a lot of whites with privilege may enjoy that same privilege today when it comes to issues like police brutality and modern day slavery and things of that sort. Just one thing that I think of recently was the issue with the woman in New York when she called the police on a Black man and pretended like she was being attacked,
Right.
knowing that that could have resulted in his death. And that sort of apathy in the situation of police brutality so that she could enjoy that privilege of being the, what would be a good term? Being the like white woman that needs help. So I just want to know if anyone wanted to discuss about that, have anything to say about that.
Can you repeat your point, Lola?
Yes,
Oh,
absolutely.
Farrah Moyes responded in the chat. Yes, weaponizing. That's definitely what it is, Farrah Moyes. And feel free to unmute your mics and speak up.
Yeah, if anyone has anything to say, just speak up.
Yeah, I just wanted to go in a little bit, just to expound, to better relay what she was trying to say. So when white people call the police on Black people, they know exactly what is going to happen. They know that police are going to use excessive force, and they use that to silence Black people, oppress them. So that is one of the ways white fragility kind of is weaponized to their advantage.
Right, right. And that's definitely what was happening with Amy Cooper, weaponizing privilege. Okay, moving on. So this was just a couple things from the proclamation of Juneteenth. Let me make this a little bigger. And looking at some of the verbiage of this, with this quote from General Gordon Granger. And y'all read through that. And so reading this quote, any reactions from people? Any thoughts on this quote?
I found this quote to be interesting because, as you can see in red, it asks for the previously enslaved people to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages, and that basically the military and the government would not oversee those, and that relationship and those wages had to be talked through the previous slave masters and slave owners. And they even say, also in red, said they will not be supported, that the previously enslaved people would not be supported in their idleness there or elsewhere. And so it was quite a shock to see that in the doctrine, because while people were celebrating Juneteenth, the American government basically was saying that while they were free, they weren't supported. And just to think about the situation that left so many enslaved people in, yes, they had their freedom, but they were basically stuck to work for little or nothing, and the financial ramifications and impact that they had for generations.
Yeah, I think
I have a question. This is Mohammed. I think going back to the previous one, I'm wondering, why don't we have any festival or something like we have, for instance, for Cinco de Mayo? We have something for Indian. We have even Greek festival here in Birmingham. Sometimes I'm wondering why we don't have that one, because that kind of raise a lot of awareness, and it's also can celebrate it. So if nobody does that, like, is there any way to kind of do that? Because going forward, I think that's an idea to kind of brainstorm about that.
We had that point brought up later on about the fact that Juneteenth is not recognized as a federal holiday or anything like that.
But getting to your point, kind of Dr. Young hit on this, Juneteenth was truly mostly celebrated in Texas. And so if you go to Texas, they celebrate Juneteenth a lot. If you go to Arizona and neighboring states around there in the South, not more of the Southeast, but more of the Southwest, Juneteenth is heavily celebrated. And I think that it's more, and like you said, maybe if we had more festivals, if we have more events, even conversations like this, we can start to celebrate it nationwide, Because I think for all people, and especially Black people and other people of color, Juneteenth is something special. And it's a time for us to celebrate the trials of our ancestors, and not to be all around doom and gloom, but something positive. I think that we just need to spread that culture out of the Southwest and all over America.
I have to echo that. We have a student in our Chapette program that asked to have today off because her family always celebrated Juneteenth. And I think Kayla's absolutely right. I grew up in Philadelphia in the Northeast, and this was not a holiday celebration up there. But I think it really took hold in those areas that were the last ones to really get emancipated. And I think the onus is upon us to really bring it back to the fore. You know, if we don't celebrate it, then nobody else is going to do it. And it's extremely important. So the onus is upon us with things like this to increase education, but also nationally to do it as well. But again, I think Kayla's right that it's really has been more localized than it has been national.
Right. And with this quote, it brings up an idea that I want to keep coming back to throughout this session, and that's the idea of free-ish. And emphasis on the ish. And as we move on, some of the freedoms that have been afforded, thinking about those and exploring those and the idea of freedom. And so with this, I'm turning it over to Lola again.
All right, so we're starting with our general discussion. So if anyone has anything to say, once again, please unmute yourself and speak up. So our very first question is in relation to the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and we wanted to know why it is relevant in today's topic. This requires you to have done some background reading in the articles that we've sent you. So if anyone can speak up.
So are we speaking about the massacre in 1921, correct? Or, no, okay, because there's something else going on with Tulsa tomorrow, so I didn't know if we were talking about that. Okay. I would say, just kind of, I wanted to mention this earlier when we were talking about free-ish. I don't know if some people understand the way in which, because if you go back to the other slide you were talking about, you are allowed to stay quietly at your home and work for wages. You are allowed to stay in the same social status that you have been in slavery, that this is what you're allowed. We're not saying you're allowed to go get an education. We're not saying you're now allowed to go read. They're not saying you're now allowed to make something out of yourself. No, you're allowed to remain quietly at your present homes and work for wages that you've been doing. And this allowed, I don't know if people know the history, but this allowed a lot of former enslaved people to become sharecroppers. My grandparents, my grandfather and his family, all of them were sharecroppers. And so I think we have to understand that, yes, we were freed in 1865 or 1863, Emancipation Proclamation. A lot of those same ideas, the systematic brainwashing, the systematic racism, the I'm going to put you in your place. This is your place as a Black person to work and to be quiet and to be docile in your position. And so you're free-ish, but you're not free to ascend to become a physician or to become an engineer, become whatever you want to be.
Yes.
So that's kind of, I just wanted to mention that. I mean, people don't realize, they say, well, the Civil War was 150 years ago. Well, I'll say, well, you know, Black people under the law didn't have equal voting rights, equal just rights until the Civil Rights Act of 1965, I believe. If I'm wrong, correct me. But that's been, what, 55 years? I mean, both of my parents are older than that. So, I mean, I just think people have to understand it wasn't 55 years so we have had legal rights, and we still, within our society, don't have all those rights or social rights, the right of innocence. I feel like, and I'll say this and I'll get off, people talk about white privilege, and I do think that is, it's true, and you know, there's a lot of facets to white privilege, but I think one important aspect is the right to be considered innocent until proven guilty. And when you have a policeman and they see a white person, that person is automatically assumed innocent until proven otherwise.
Hey, definitely, you're going to get all of our points.
I'm so sorry, I'm about to go. I'll just say, white people don't always have that same, when they're not always presumed innocent, they're sometimes presumed guilty until otherwise. I'll let you guys go. I'm sorry, I just got excited.
Yes, that was amazing. That everything you brought up is amazing from freedoms and still not being completely free on to what, yes. And a lot of that stuff we're gonna reach later on, but yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you guys.
And so with what we're talking about with, the question was about today and specifically Juneteenth in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Because what you were talking about, Deslin, you're right. They're the massacre, but specifically today.
And this was something Deslin was alluding to earlier, but if someone wants to speak up on it, it has to do with the events that are going to occur tomorrow.
Is this about President Trump doing a rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but it being canceled due to Juneteenth?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, basically, I just have a little bit of information about it, but he was planning on doing like a presidential rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but due to the kind of pressure about Juneteenth happening, he decided to cancel it, and I think it's happening tomorrow in Tulsa or something, just not today.
Right.
So this brings up two heavy issues. Like stated earlier, President Trump's first rally was set to be today, but it's actually been moved to tomorrow on such a historic day in the African American community. And this goes back to what Deslin already spoke about, but in relation to Juneteenth, and not only Juneteenth, but also the location in regards to the Tulsa mass riots. If you could go to the next slide, Michael. So would anyone like to speak up about what they've learned regarding the Tulsa race massacre or the race riots, or however you've learned that it's been termed?
I'll speak up. So I learned about the massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, just through family. I think it's a story that's talked about a lot in the Black community. It's a sense of a lot of sadness, especially when it comes to how successful the businesses were in Tulsa. You know, Black people love talking about Black Wall Street and how beautiful it was and how successful it was, and where would we be if we still had Black Wall Street. There are always a lot of movements to restart Black Wall Street and to improve Black businesses. And I think probably reiterating what a lot of people will say, never learned about it in school, only really learned about it sitting at the dinner table with my family.
And I'll provide some background information for anyone who doesn't know much about the Tulsa Race Massacre. So what happened was that there was a young Black man in the elevator, and apparently those who were around heard the white elevator attendant, who was a young white woman. She screamed and he ran out of the elevator. No one really knows what happened that day, but it was Memorial Day weekend, so people believe neither of them should have been in the elevator. There's a lot of speculation of whether they were lovers, if they had known each other previously, if it was some sort of assault. But what happened was that the young woman decided not to press charges. However, it became a sensationalized article in other parts of Oklahoma. So due to the fact that there were race riots happening around the country, members of the KKK and white groups decided to basically find the young man and lynch him. So he ran home to his mother's house in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in Greenwood, which is where Black Wall Street is. And the police chief found out about what was happening, so he decided to hide him in the police tower and keep guards around to make sure that there was no way that he would be attacked. However, groups of rioters continued to amass, and the fact that there were also Black citizens who decided that they would keep up and protect the city, those rioters felt like it was what they would term a Negro uprising. So eventually what happened was there was sort of an altercation between white protesters and Black protesters, and a shot was fired. And from then on, shots continued to be fired throughout the night. Eventually more people came pouring in, and it went from the police tower all throughout Greenwood. upset white mobsters decided to just tear down the entire place. If you can see the article, if you can see the photo, the first photo actually says "running the Negro out of Tulsa." That was how frustrated they are with the thought of Black people kind of like doing something for themselves and creating sort of like a secluded community, despite what was going on outside of Tulsa. Not only that, but the National Guard was called in and they decided to protect the white homes. The firefighters came through and white protesters continued to shoot at them, and the firefighters decided that it was not worth their life to risk to try to save these homes, so they decided to leave them to fend for themselves. So you can see that I've listed more than 1,200 homes were destroyed, over 300 people were killed. This includes both Blacks and whites. I've also included an article at the end where there's a firsthand perspective from the last living survivor of that race riot, where she talks about what she'd seen and what she'd gone through, gone through, like hiding under the tables and hearing all the shots that were fired. This was truly like one of the worst massacres in American history. So knowing that this was something that happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and knowing that the President of the United States, who some people would call even to be like a known racist, deciding to come into a city with one of the worst sites of racial violence and also on such a prominent holiday, what does this infer about like our public knowledge of Juneteenth?
And that's a great point that's being discussed in the chat. I'm trying to keep up. Allie brought up a good point about the lack of diversity and insensitivity in Trump's staff, resulting in them not realizing it. And Andreas also brings up a good point about this being a deliberate thing, planning it on Juneteenth. And Tim brings up kind of on the side of a lack of knowledge. But it's hard to tell. And it says, but knowing how Trump has acted the last few weeks, you have to think that it's an intentional form of intimidation and a power play. So these are good points, and definitely someone speak up and your ideas of, do you think Trump did this intentionally or not?
Hey, I'll just add to my point that I do think it's very deliberate, because to me it's much in the same way of weaponizing your privilege and like status. It's very similar to I'm forgetting her name now, but the white woman in New York, where usually, you know, people in power, they are very deliberate in wanting to seem ignorant to their actions and behavior when they are very aware all the time. And you can see it in her, you know, knowing exactly what was going to happen when she calls the police. And this is very much the same thing. It's all very deliberate, and they know exactly what they're doing, and they know exactly the type of like fear that they're trying to instill.
Yes, Dr. Grabowski, we're talking about Amy Cooper. But yes.
So I think it's also important to hold people accountable. As him being the president of America, and especially the current state of America, is it acceptable that he didn't know about Juneteenth, or no one on his cabinet and knew about Juneteenth, or knew the significance of Juneteenth and the significance of Tulsa?
Interesting point. You give someone who is not African American but is a leader of America a pass for not knowing about that. Is that acceptable?
And just to give background as to, just to give background as to why most people would consider this to be an issue, is that knowing that the President of the United States were to be coming into an area, that would basically cause the city to shut down. So they would not be able to have those Juneteenth celebrations in that area. So whoever was speaking up, you can go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to make sure everyone noticed the nuance of police brutality in the Tulsa incident. And now Black Lives Matter, one of their main points is, you know, police brutality has got to stop. And a big part of the Black Wall Street bombing was that the police that were called in, they didn't help the people that were being attacked, but instead helped with raiding some people. So they joined the mob, the white mobsters, in attacking the citizens of Black Wall Street. And we all know Trump is very fond of excessive force. So I find this extremely intentional, and it shouldn't be looked at otherwise.
This is Jasper. I agree with Faramoy. I think like it's very hard to see your president say things like, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Someone who is chomping at the bit almost to murder Black citizens in his country. It seems very unlikely to me that this was unintentional. It seems like deliberate intimidation.
And that's something we're going to get to later, talking about the Black Lives Matter movement in comparison to the privilege of those who protested quarantine, and looking at the comparisons between the people who, I believe it was in Michigan, went to the state capitol and protested with assault rifles in the state capitol, and looking at those individuals of the majority versus the Black Lives Matter movement and police's response to it. And so we're going to keep moving on. And I believe Kayla is going to cover this.
Like many of you guys, this slide, 4th of July versus Juneteenth, is an interesting topic. It's definitely a topic that's is often discussed in the Black community as to whether we should celebrate the 4th of July. And I know that we sent out, I wanted to know if anybody had read the speech called What to the Slave is the 4th of July. Has anyone heard of that? This speech was basically given by Frederick Douglass in 1852, and it just called out the hypocrisy of the majority celebrating the 4th of July when at this point, Black people were considered property. And the first time I learned about Juneteenth was actually on the 4th of July. I was at a summer program at Howard, and they made us read this entire speech, and we had a discussion on it. And it wasn't to not celebrate the 4th of July, but to remember that the 4th of July for our ancestors was very different. And that while the 4th of July is a national holiday and it is celebrated, we shouldn't forget about our day where we were technically considered free. I think there's a lot of comparison between the 4th of July. People ask, and this came up earlier, why don't we celebrate Juneteenth? And I think it has a lot to do with people recognizing it as a holiday. You know, people are off for the 4th of July. I know we're going into medicine, so not every physician is off on the 4th of July, but most people are off on the 4th of July. And so they're able to celebrate with their families, they're able to go on vacations and truly commemorate that moment in history for American history. But African Americans aren't necessarily given that right on Juneteenth. We have to request it, and even if you request it, it's not technically a federal holiday, so it does not have to be given to you. Just wanted to know people's thoughts on that and ways that you think we could move forward with that, and if you feel like Juneteenth should be a federal holiday.
I wanted to say one thing about generally federal holidays, and that's that the bar is not necessarily high for some of our federal holidays. We have Columbus Day. It's currently a federal holiday. And Christopher Columbus didn't even land in the United States. And so if we have something like that that seems so tangential and not relevant to really most of, even white Americans, it's not relevant to anyone. If we celebrate that, why don't we celebrate June 19th? If the bar is that low, why would we not do this?
Good point, Itamar. Good point. Anyone else?
Yeah, I guess just to speak on that, I've seen a lot, maybe it's just on social media, but a lot of people talking about replacing Columbus Day, which is like arguably shouldn't be a federal holiday, with Juneteenth, which like obviously very well should be a recognized federal holiday. So I feel like I've seen more of that discussion, but I think that's something that still needs to happen.
Right. Because I see, you're right, Anka. I see people try to change Columbus Day into Indigenous Peoples Day. I see from what put in the chat as well. But it's still the fact that it's originally Columbus Day, because I can see a lot of benefit coming from making Juneteenth a holiday. And I know with the Black Lives Matter movement, there's a push this year to celebrate Juneteenth and protest 4th of July? I want to hear people's thoughts on that, of not celebrating 4th of July.
I don't necessarily think that the 4th of July shouldn't be celebrated. I just think that Juneteenth should be equally important.
Okay. Okay.
I agree as well, Kayla. And I think that gets into Frederick Douglass' quote, if you're going to address it, I don't want to step on your toes, but just encouraging everyone to read that. And now, what is your thought about that quote listed on the slide?
All right, any thoughts on the quote? Good point, Grace, in the chat. It's a lot of people agreeing with Kayla. I see Deslin with the dual identities, celebrating equally proud to be Black and American.
Yeah, and I think that's the case for most Black Americans. You know, we're proud to be American, and we're very proud to be Black. And sometimes it feels like those things are mutually exclusive, but they're not. I think, speaking on what Frederick Douglass says, I think that there's a lot of reflection that can happen for our counterparts on Juneteenth, the same type of reflection that we may have on 4th of July. And I think someone said that in the chat. Honestly, we should use both of these holidays to really just learn more and to expose more people to things. I think that it really helped me to see that when I think at the time I was only 16, to read that speech on the 4th of July. And while I celebrated and enjoyed my 4th, I still had in the back of my mind, I was thinking about my ancestors and just the things, the plight of Americans and where we've been and how far we've come. And we have so much more to go, but it's nice to just have a retrospective look. And like Dr. Young said, if you don't know your past and you don't know your history, you'll never know your future.
Candace brought up a good point. If you want to get on the mic and expound on that anymore. I don't know if she's able to, but that she brings up a good point about peaceful protest by taking a knee in those similar arguments.
Hey, Michael, I'll just say that I think for me, I often feel like, especially for some people in white America, that we feel there's this sense that it's sort of an either or proposition that,
right,
you know, right. It's like and there's this I feel like there's this fear that if, you know, African Americans gain any ground, then automatically it's going to hurt whatever. And it's sort of this, you know, kind of two different sides or three different sides. And I just think it reflects on the fact that we can't think of this as a both and kind of thing. Like Kayla was saying, is that you can do both and it's great, you know, and that just because one becomes a holiday doesn't mean it diminishes anything else. It actually adds to Independence Day by having Juneteenth as a recognized holiday. It adds to the richness of July 4th.
Right. Right, and that's something Candace just said. If you don't like everything about America, then you shouldn't belong to America. And that idea of either you're for the country, you can't say anything bad about the country, or you shouldn't be here. And recently in the media, Colin Kaepernick was a situation where a man who during the national anthem took a knee, a peaceful protest, and so many people came out to where he got blackballed for that and seen as un-American. So
I think that also goes back to the Emancipation Proclamation about remaining quiet. And I don't think that this necessarily just applies to the Black community, but I think when any oppressed community comes up and tries to speak for themselves in America, you know, people get scared because they want people to remain quiet and to deal and just take what people have been serving us instead of standing up for ourselves. Even if it is peaceful, people have a problem with it. And so I think that's why that was bolded on those slides. You know, that tone that was set hundreds of years ago, it's still kind of in the tone, even though it may not come from the government itself, but that's the tone of American society, is that you need to be quiet.
If I can add
something?
Yes, I was just about to read your thing, yeah.
I was just gonna say, I think
Okay.
I hope y'all can hear me. I'm outside. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, you sound good.
Okay. I was just gonna say, I think a lot of times when people say those things like, I support your right to protest, but I don't agree with this way, if you challenge them, they can't even say a way they'd approve of. So what they really mean is they just don't want to see it. And that's not right.
Right. That's something good to think about. It's something good to think about. And that's transitioning into this current point of, what is freedom? And going on from slavery, it's still, even though the chains have been removed, they've just manifested in different forms. And as Deslin was bringing up earlier, that when a lot of slaves are freed, they went on to sharecrop. And the fact that you freed this huge population that had been enslaved for centuries and gave them no type of foundation for them to go on with. And I'm just reading Dr. Peterson and Tim's. Good point, y'all. I'll get back to those in a second. And sharecroppers not having much. And a lot of those conditions in sharecropping were not that different from slavery. And a lot of people's ancestors, after being removed from slavery, they didn't have a skill. They didn't have a trade. They didn't have anything they could do to support themselves. And to try to go out in America and make something of themselves, still be faced with racism and still be faced with so much against them. To a lot of people, it was worth it just to stay on your plantation and work a similar role, just with a different title as a sharecropper. And this brings up the 13th Amendment, also passed in the 1860s. And this verbiage, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And now you have mass incarceration. And the chains have changed, and they're just manifested as handcuffs now. They're manifested as mass incarceration. And you see the slavery of pre-Civil War, of the antebellum South, transition into the prison industrial complex and voter suppression. And all these things moving forward, slavery was still very much there, but the chains weren't. And so if you were someone of the majority, it'll be very easy to say, what's the issue? You're no longer a slave, you're a free person. So that's what we get into, that's what we're about to get into with voter suppression, with you have the right to vote, but there's so much that goes into it. And mental freedom, PTSD, but this is all gonna come back, and I'm gonna tie it into this idea of positive and negative rights. And before I get into it, does anyone in the call want to speak up about the idea of positive and negative rights? I know if anyone here was in philosophy or ethics, they probably have heard of it.
I didn't necessarily want to speak on that, but I just wanted to say that like these examples that we have listed here are just truly examples of systemic racism. I think we talk about systematic racism and systemic racism, but people don't necessarily know what that means and
Right.
where that comes from. And so like this just shows like, like he said, the mental freedom and the sharecropping, and like sharecropping has such a long-lasting effect on the finances of the Black community. And I mean, people were just living off of credit. And so this, like, even though the Civil War ended, that was just truly the beginning of systemic racism in America.
Right. And did anyone want to hit positive or negative rights? I'll go ahead and go over it. But essentially, positive and negative rights is the idea of a positive right is your right to do something. Your right to be able to be somewhere to do something. And a negative right is a right for you to not have something done to you. The right for you not to be subjected to something. And without both of those, you can't truly be free. And moving forward and relating back to sharecropping, voter suppression, and such, we have positive and negative rights, where you see the United States giving some forms of positive rights, where the Emancipation Proclamation, you're no longer a slave, you're a free person. Brown versus Board of Education, you can go to schools. Civil Rights Act, furthermore, you are considered equal. The Voting Rights Act, and you can be the president. These are positive rights. but it's not much acknowledgement to the negative rights. Even though you're free and you're no longer a slave, do you have the right to move into a community and not face racism and not be subjected to terror from the Ku Klux Klan and not be subjected to things from your community? And that is the biggest question of, you have these rights to do things, but Jim Crow is still there. And I just saw someone put it, yeah, Jared just put it in the chat. Jim Crow is there. And so America is giving out these positive rights, but is there acknowledgement to negative rights? And I want to hear from people about that. And this goes into the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, so I guess one of the things, like, I think you did a really good job explaining the difference between the two. And you mentioned that negative rights seem to be one of those things that aren't always fulfilled. And I think like the notion of that is that negative rights, I don't want to say seem less obvious per se, but they're not, because they're not explicitly stated, it's so much easier for those rights to be taken away. And like with Jim Crow and so many other things that have occurred, like, because those rights haven't been explicitly stated, it's been so easy for those rights to be taken away. So you have to fight so much harder to retain those rights.
Right. And that's what I was getting into. And thanks, Ankit, for that. Thanks, Ankit, for that. And negative rights when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement, because over time you see these rights just not be acknowledged. And an example for me was my grandfather was drafted in the Korean War in the 1950s. He was on a submarine for a few years. He came back to America and he went to vote. Yeah, he was able to vote, but when he went to register to vote, he was given an aptitude test, just a test of standard things that any voting age American should know, like the 3 branches of government, the capital of your state and such. And the kind man politely asked my grandfather, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? If you pass the aptitude test, you can vote. And there should be, that brings up the idea of negative rights where you shouldn't be subjected to that. And the Voting Rights Act passed eventually, and my grandfather didn't vote until after that. And this is a man who had served his country and comes back and is faced with that. And something else for me personally, oh, I didn't mean to do that. Something else for me personally is growing up in Birmingham, going with my father. Before I could drive, I was about 10 or 11. We were driving around Eastlake in Birmingham on a Saturday. And my dad tells me, hey, Michael, whatever you do, don't turn around. I'm like 11 years old. So the first thing I do is, and it's a cop following behind us extremely close. And he just follows us. And I'm asking my dad, it's like, what's going on? And my dad says, just stay calm. Whatever happens, just stay calm. And the cop continues to follow us all the way home. And my dad, just to see what's going on, he turns off the main road to get home. And we're going on kind of a scenic route. And the cop continues to follow us. And my dad tells me, if the cop pulls us over and asks us about a gun, say no. Legally, he owned the gun. My father legally possesses a gun. It was like, nothing good will happen. And the negative right to be Black in America and to drive and not be subjected to being followed with no just cause, being pulled over without any just cause and harassed. And building up to what is manifested as the Black Lives Matter movement, being able to get pulled over and grab for your wallet, grab for your legal registration for a firearm, and not be shot because you're a Black man grabbing for something. And the ability for you to sit in your apartment, as I am right now, and you can eat ice cream and not have a police officer barge in your apartment and shoot you without giving any explanation. Both in Gene. The right for you to be drunk and to take a nap in your car and lay down without driving and endangering other people on the road and not be killed. And the right for you to be able to write a bad check and not be subjected to having a police officer put his knee in your neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And most importantly, the right for you to be born Black and not feel that you have a target on you. These are the negative rights that are hard to, and many people feel have never been addressed. And at every stage of freedom and rights that America can say, where is that acknowledgement? And as we were talking about earlier, racism being systemic. Because even though you are in this space, are you really free? And the idea of free-ish. So I want to hear what people have to say. I want to hear from people in the chat. Unmute yourself. What do y'all think about this? The positive and the negative rights.
So, Michael, I wanted to thank you for your experience when you were a kid. You know, with your talking about your father being followed by a police officer. I have to say I've had similar instances before coming to medical school. Before being an EMT, I did some ride-alongs with police officers, and I noticed one of the things that they would do was in certain neighborhoods, relatively high Black population, relatively poor neighborhoods, they would essentially use any minor infraction so that they were able to pull someone over. So for instance, if your license plate light was out, then that gave them a reason to pull you over, and then they could check everything else. And they could also pull you out of the car, assess what was going on. And a lot of that, I mean, there's a lot of negativity in that region. And I don't know if it was because of experience bias for them, but it was very obvious that it was going on, and it was kind of unnerving to see.
And that brings up the idea of experience bias and the idea of, isn't that what training is for? To be able to navigate through that and not feel like you have to fear for your life when you pull up on a 12-year-old playing with a toy gun. Tamir Rice. And those instances, experience bias or not, brings up the question of, is there something deeper? Any thoughts? I'm trying to keep up with the chat.
Hey, Michael, I wanted to go back to like your previous, bring up the topic about free-ish and just kind of like what that looks like today. And it's actually funny because I was having these conversations very recently with my roommate and other people and friends. And one concept that came up was, are we, in people's opinion, are Black people relatively more free than they were in slavery? You know, when you think of the relative position in society and all of that, has there really been any movement, you know? Because if the freedoms of all groups increase, it's like, yes, technically on an absolute level, there's more freedom. But if relatively speaking, and if you look at the discrepancies between the groups, you know, can you really say any progress has actually been made? So just kind of the concept.
Right, right. And that idea is something I've seen looking at the rhetoric of a lot of people who are against the Black Lives Matter movement, but are for people quarantining to go to bars, and seeing the difference in mentalities of it. And so for this, it's kind of long, but I have a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. The the main point of it is that protests, rioting, whatever may manifest, is the language of the unheard. And I want to hear what people have to say about that, people think about that.
Just this whole idea of questioning the government by protesting is, I think, a good thing, right? It allows the government to think about things that they need to change, but it hasn't been done. So having this movement and continue to protest is a vital thing to continue this fight.
Right, right. And that's something we're gonna keep moving. How does this relate to medicine? Any ideas? How does it relate specifically to us as medical students? Let me clarify. Specifically to us as medical students, how does this relate?
So I think this was circling back to kind of Obi's point earlier regarding systemic racism, and also the quote that we first started with, and this idea of being free but not supported. So for me, one situation that really sticks out is education. For
Right.
particularly minority communities, public education is so unequal. So technically you're saying, you're free to aspire to be a physician, but even from the very start, from K-12, you're having to work 10 times harder, right? Your schools aren't
Yes.
as funded. It's harder for you to even get where you even need to be to even apply for medical school.
Right, right. And that brings us wait, someone was saying something. Go ahead.
I did want to say that following off of what Jada said, there's a James Baldwin quote that I view as kind of mirroring the King quote about language of the unheard. And he gets asked about looting in this pointed interview at one point. And he asked back at the reporter, he says, "Who is looting who?" And I always think about that when I think about anti-racist movements and any sort of response, any sort of opposition or defiance that is shown by Black people towards sort of the white establishment and racism. It's who is looting who. Any sort of poor single individual walks into a store and takes a television. That doesn't matter that much. But white communities continually extracting resources out of Black communities via just extracting labor and never reinvesting anything of substance, never reinvesting any sort of actual education, always using those resources for the betterment of white individuals versus Black individuals. That is, just the picture perfect mirror of how slavery developed as this looting of the African continent by colonial powers. And it's just a continuation on centuries of oppression, essentially.
Right. And this, specifically us as medical students, how this relates, as Jada brought up. This is a letter from Emory Medical School's Office of Admission. And it says, basically apologizes that they can't accept someone for being a Negro. And we're trying to wrap up in the next 10 minutes or so. I know some people got to go. And this today, where people have a seat at the table, but do you feel comfortable at the table? Do you feel like you belong at the table? Because a lot of people since then, Black people and underrepresented people are in medicine. And looking at, now that you are here, how is your experience? I know Dr. Young could probably speak up if he's still here, or anyone else on this idea.
The discussion has been fabulous, and I'm glad that Michael and everybody has done this. I'm older than you guys. I've lived through a lot of this, a lot of racism toward me individually, and also with friends of mine. At Hopkins, where I went to medical school, and it speaks to this letter that you put up. Johns Hopkins has 120 students. It would be lucky if they had 1 or 2. African Americans. It wasn't until Dr. Levi Watkins, who was the first medical student to graduate from Vanderbilt and then go on to Hopkins to do his CV. And it was because of him being an outstanding surgeon and being vocal that he got on the admissions committee. I know I may have mentioned this before to you all, but he fought to get African American students at Hopkins. And by the time I got there in 1983, gosh, I'm so old, our class had 16, 17 students. When I went back for my reunion, I guess it was 30-year reunion, the buildings were great. They had gotten $1 billion from Michael Bloomberg, another $1 billion from a sheikh or whatever to build great new buildings. And I saw some students, African-American students, hanging out at the part where the medical students are. And I asked them, how many of you are in the class? And they said 6. I said, well, that's not good considering we had a lot more back when Dr. Watkins was there. And what really struck me was that the vast majority of even those 6 and this is not to disparage African origin, and we love our Nigerian students and everybody else, but the vast majority of them were first generation from Africa. And I said, like, are there not plenty of African Americans that have been here for generations and generations that Hopkins could find to go to medical school? So the fight continues, but the fight continues with you all next, with Dr. Vickers being dean of the medical school, with me being an ODI. We have a lot we need to do. It's a lot better. You may not think it is, but UAB is a lot better than it was. And these are fights that we have to continually take on every day and be out there in front of everybody and do our best and be in excel, but also to not accept those microaggressions, not to just accept them, not to just accept, well, that's okay or that's okay. I think being vocal and verbal about it's fine in a respectful way. That's great. But I think we still need to keep these issues at the forefront, because I forget who brought it up, that everything you're talking about, and I'm sorry to be philosophical, is about power. It's about position.
Right.
And if you have power and if you have position, then you want to keep it. And anything you give up takes away from you. And it's not just that's throughout the world. That's history. That those in power want to remain in power. You just look at your history. It's always the case. And so we continually have to bring these points up by being excellent in what we do. You know, you let us know in ODI and MSS if there are issues, we have to address them. That's our responsibility. And that's why we're here. And that's why I'm thankful for Dr. Hosley and Dr. Von Wagner and everybody else who's taking the time to listen. Because I'm sure there are a lot of schools where they won't even do that, where if you had a chat like this, that those folks wouldn't even show up.
Right.
So that's why and I'll shut up, that's why we need you all to help us to come up with cogent strategies to make things better, and also to educate your fellow classmates, because that's a big point. But I'll be quiet.
Right, and I see some points in the chat. I just wanted to kind of piggyback on what you were saying, and like positive and negative rights, what we were talking about earlier. And for those who are pre-meds, I know some pre-meds are in here and some incoming students, Dr. Carlton Young is the Assistant Dean for Medical Student Diversity and Inclusion. So he's seen a lot of this and he's seen a lot of growth, and he's working on a lot at UAB. And those people in that office are definitely helpful in moving the culture forward. Ms. Erica Brown, I don't know if she's here, an advocate for students. Ms. Jenna, Ms. Carolyn, and those people are great. And when we have the positive right to come into medical school and be a student in medical school, also bring up the negative rights, where the first students who started medical school at Hopkins probably didn't have the best experience. They probably didn't have a prejudice-free experience. And making sure that that culture moves forward to where we don't have students at any UAB School of Medicine using the N-word. And we don't have students at the UAB School of Medicine making microaggressions to me, to people I know, and people around here. And what it takes to move that culture forward. And that takes a lot. And in the town halls and everything that we've been seeing earlier, I look and I hear Dr. Van Wagner talking, hear Dr. Hosley, hear Dr. Young, and thinking about, with institutional action, the culture among the individuals must change. And how does that happen? It takes generations. And I see in the chat a lot of people asking about pipeline programs. Max, you want to speak up to what this point is? I'm trying to catch up on it.
Yeah, sure. I think we were talking about mostly how it's bigger than just in the med school. It's that a lot of people can't get to where we are. And something I noticed, that even I came from a middle-class white family, but it cost me a lot of money to apply for med school, to get the MCAT books, get everything else. And there are a lot of communities that want to do that, but can't, that don't have the resources to even start in middle and high school. So starting in middle school, like Farah Moy just said, is a great way to do it. And I think UAB is in a position to be a leader on that. And I think it's something that we could develop from our existing infrastructure, because we have, I don't know what the program is, but there is a
SHPEP is one of them currently going on.
So once you get into undergrad at UAB, you're automatically accepted or whatever to UAB medical school. And I think we could use that existing infrastructure to go into high schools in the area or across the state, or middle schools or whatever, to develop that and recruit more minority students to be interested in medicine, and to use that to give more spots to minority students at UAB. I don't know.
If people are still on the call, I want to get Farah Moy, Morgan Owens, or someone to speak about the SNMA Integrative Healthcare Conference. That's happened in the past. Jared as well.
All right, so I can speak on this a little bit. I've helped out in the past with the SHPEP, actually both with SHPEP and with the Health Summit. In the past, we've had approximately 300 students, both high school and college, come to UAB and have the opportunity just to be exposed to different types of the different types of healthcare fields. Like I said again, they are exposed at high school and undergraduate level, but we do think it's important that there are some populations in the community that need to be exposed much earlier than high school.
And just to add on that, the summit, the Integrative Healthcare Summit, was not just the School of Medicine. Dentistry was there, nursing was there, so it was multiple programs that are in the healthcare field. So we think that's important as well.
So can I ask, just, is there a way for medical students to help out with that, or for also a way to develop a program at UAB to help with resources like MCAT books, applications, things like that we can do to help students in the Birmingham area? Or is that
there's several right now. There's several organizations that work with that. We can send out that information, maybe in an email. I know AOHS works with Carver High School. The Integration Health Summit is something that SNMA hosted, and we sent out a link for volunteers, and so you could volunteer with that. We can send all of that out in an email so people know a little bit more about the opportunities to get involved.
Good. And I know a lot of people have to go, and so we're bringing this back to medicine, kind of onto this, and talking about some stuff going on. And this is all kind of laying the seeds and putting down the roots for future discussions. This is something we want to do maybe once a month or so, and have discussions about topics that are relevant not only to Black America, but relevant to medicine and relevant to all of us, so we can grow and understand each other. Because that's the biggest thing that can come from this, is people understanding each other more, and the feeling of otherness being destroyed, and getting rid of that otherness to where people can empathize and care about each other. And so these are just a couple of points that we had thought about for the future, such as the legacy of J. Marion Sims, thought of the father of modern gynecology, and how his work has contributed negatively to the Black community, And even at UAB, there's a J. Marion Sims Endowed Chair in the Obstetrics and Gynecology Department. Aubrey, you want to come in?
Yeah, so I think, I know we're running low on time, so I won't go into super details, but these are just examples of situations where Black people have trusted doctors to take care of them and they've been taken advantage of. And I think there's a huge history of mistrust amongst American history between Black people and white people. And I think that as future physicians, someone's raising their hand. As future physicians, I think it's important to recognize and understand the history behind this mistrust between Black patients and white physicians, and that it's our responsibility to commit to repairing it and making sure these things don't happen again in the future.
Hey, I just wanted to comment. Hi guys, I'm Zach. I'm the president of the DCGMB committee and also like a fourth year OBGYN resident at UAB. But this history about J. Marion Sims and this position at UAB is definitely something that as a program we have discussed. I don't know if there's been much action, but kind of how we've talked about before, that making change in an institution or in society is based on like who has the power, and the more vocal you are about it, the more things can change. But you have to have somebody who's able to advocate for your being in a position of power to actually kind of move it into the right direction. So the more we can have these discussions and the more we can like talk about it, it's kind of helps advocate for change. But this whole history of, besides just J. Marion Sims, is also an instrument used in obstetrics and gynecology called a Sims speculum, that a lot of OBGYNs are trying to change the terminology for it and call it a different object. But this has been a concern with this new Black Lives Movement and the now awareness amongst more colleagues about how this has affected us. And also the Henrietta Lacks, if anyone has read the book, and how that has kind of taken the trust out of physicians for using research or doing research, especially at UAB. A lot of the patient populations do not trust UAB physicians to do any research and have been unwilling to participate, which has kind of shortened or lowered our numbers of kind of Black African Americans participating in trials and not giving a good representation of what certain studies or certain outcomes are in that community, which would be very important, especially in our given population. So I think these are all really good topics to discuss and kind of continue to bring to the forefront.
Thank you, Zach. And yeah, so this is what we want to have. We want to try to send out something to everyone who's here. And for anyone who has to go, I'm gonna skip for a second. Go ahead and take down these email addresses if you have any topic suggestions of stuff we can discuss in the future. I'm about to pass it to Allison so we can wrap up. But this is exactly what we want with these ideas going on, and seeing what is it in the future we want to talk about and relate to what's going on today. So take a screenshot of that right quick, and I'm about to pass it to Allison so we can wrap up.
Really quick, Michael, I saw that Dr. Brown raised her hand, so I think she has something to add.
Okay.
Yeah, hi everybody. I just quickly wanted to comment on a book that I think, there's a lot of conversation about Black Lives Matter and sort of understanding some of the history and how that has moved us forward to where we are today. And it's called Carceral Capitalism. And what you were really talking about is the idea of necropolitics, biopower, and biopolitics at work. So if you've never read that book, it's a short read, maybe 300 pages or less, but it explains sort of where we've come from and how we are as a people being policed, and how we look at the police force, but they are really caught in the middle of all of this. It goes higher than that, as we all know. And it is a fabulous book. So I would really suggest that you guys consider that as a read. It would be a great discussion. It brings up all kinds of answers to many of the topics and comments that have been made today. But I really want to thank you guys for.
Be sure to spell that in the chat, because I'm not sure you spell that.
Okay, I'll send it to you. I got your email.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Allison.
Hey everyone. So once again, thank you so much for attending. I wish we had more time to discuss this question, but I'll just leave this as a reflection question for you to think about later. But this was a quote taken from the New York Times article that we sent out, and it references a rupture. Although we're celebrating something today, we can't forget that over the past couple of weeks, there's been so much discourse in this country, political unrest, cultural unrest, and it's still something that we have to keep in mind. So I just pose a question. Like a physical rupture, since we are physicians, something to actually think about in our own personal context, there's often a hemorrhaging that immediately follows, but there's also healing. What does this healing process look like to you after so much political and cultural unrest? We don't have to address this now, but something for you to think about as we continue to have these conversations.
Did you want to let someone answer, or you want to keep going?
You're really
If someone has a brief comment, you can add something. If not, we can continue on. So once again, Juneteenth presents an opportunity for those of the African American community as well as the Mezcagos of Mexico. Just a fun fact that Juneteenth is not only celebrated in America, but also in Mexico, and we'll share some information about that in a link later. And so we just want to continue to highlight that we want to celebrate our history, our heritage, and our freedom. And this event still stands as the longest running African American holiday and represents the relentless perseverance of Black culture. You can move forward, Michael.
All right.
So once again, if you have further discussions, please feel free to email us. And also, if you have your mobile device and you can access this QR code, we've compiled a list of articles that go into some deeper history about medical bondage and celebration of Juneteenth in a village in Mexico and other facts that we couldn't dive into completely today. So feel free to use that QR code, and maybe we'll try to send it out on our Instagram page as well so you can access these documents too.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you everybody who came. This is great, giving us an idea of how these discussions will flow. We'll try to cut things down and leave more room for discussion, because that was a big worry right now when we went into this, was thinking about getting people engaged. But I'm glad everyone is eager to talk and eager to discuss, and we want to do everything we can to make more room for that. And we want to make room for discussion. So definitely email me, email these other email addresses. If you're interested in maps, if you're a pre-med interested in maps, email that email, and we'll get everything set. And if anyone else had any other points that they wanted to say, definitely let me know. I'm hanging out here for a little bit if anyone had any points they want to bring up. But otherwise, yeah, thanks. Thanks so much. And I appreciate it. I really do appreciate it, y'all supporting SNMA, supporting Juneteenth, and just the amount of support the medical school has shown in general about the Black Lives Matter movement. Yes, ma'am. I'll see your message, Ms. Jenna. All right. Ms. Erica Brown, I see your hands up.
Hey, Michael, that was from before.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I just didn't.
Yeah.
I don't know how to put. I'm still learning how to do that. So sorry. Y'all did a great job. I mean, this was a great conversation. We definitely need more of these. I'm so glad that you guys are taking the lead on it as well.
Yes, ma'am. And moving forward, we want to try to do everything we can. I was surprised by the turnout. I'm definitely grateful. Like Mr. Zach Walker, Dr. Zach Walker. Glad he came through. I didn't realize residents were here. Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't realize the diversity of the audience. and so many different people in medicine.
Yeah, we sent emails to a lot of people to jump
Okay.
yeah, so that's why, because we thought it was important. So a lot of people in MSS sent out emails, not only ODI but MSS as well. So we're very supportive.
Y'all did a really great job, Michael.
Really did.
All right, I see a couple private messages that people want to stick on, and I don't know if you want to speak privately or if you want to speak in general.
Maybe we should take the recording off, Michael. Should we stop?